The dead don't negotiate. That's what made the transmission impossible. Sub-Commander Verath-Sol pressed 4 of its sensory filaments against the receiver housing and felt the vibration again. Carrier wave modulation in a pattern that hadn't existed for 63 orbital cycles. Not natural echo. Not drift noise from the debris field. Something was shaping those waves on purpose, with intent, with the particular obsessive precision that Verath-Sol had only ever read about in decommissioned threat assessments. The Ascending Meridian was a survey vessel. It carried 11 crew, 2 kilometers of trawling sensor array, and enough fuel to map the outer dissolution zone before the next conjunction. It was not armed. It had never needed to be armed. The war was over. The war had been over for 63 cycles. Verath-Sol clicked its beak twice, the autonomic stress response it had never managed to suppress despite 3 cycles of neural conditioning, and pulled up the old files. The files it wasn't supposed to need anymore. The files labeled, in governance standard script, human behavioral catalogs, archival, and no operational value. The transmission came again. This time it contained words. Navigator Verath-Sol was running routine dissolution drift calculations in the secondary processing bay when the alert icon bloomed across its visual field like a hemorrhage. The icon was the color of old rust, a color Verath-Sol's species associated with spoiled organic matter, chosen deliberately by governance cartographers to mark certain categories of space. Contested zones, former conflict zones, zones where what humanity had built still occasionally fell. Verath-Sol had been born 9 cycles after the silence, the official governance designation for the end of the human resistance. It had grown up learning about humans the way young members of its cohort learned about anything classified as resolved threat, in careful past tense, with footnotes, in rooms that had no windows. The past tense had always felt slightly forced to Verath-Sol, the way a translation feels when the original language has a word for something your language doesn't. Something that doesn't map cleanly. It pulled up the rust-colored icon and found, to its considerable alarm, that it linked directly to an active comm thread that Sub-Commander Verath-Sol had flagged Amber Internal, a rating that meant I know this looks strange, but I am not yet ready to tell governance it looks strange. Verath-Sol reviewed the audio file. It listened to it 3 times. On the 3rd pass it identified the voice quality, the particular resonance, the bilateral vocal symmetry, the slight mechanical compression of a suit-integrated microphone, and its secondary circulatory system, the one that handled emergency oxygen distribution, began cycling at threat response. The voice was human. The voice was saying, "I know you can hear me. I know this frequency still works because you're still using the same receiver architecture you were using when we built it for you. You're welcome, by the way. I need to talk to whoever's in command. Tell them it's about the cash." Then a pause. Then, "Tell them I'm the last one. Tell them I've been the last one for 40 years. Tell them I'm tired." Verath-Sol convened the senior staff in the map room because the map room had no recording devices, a design feature that every officer in governance survey knew about and no one officially acknowledged. What happened in the map room was, technically, navigation discussion. What happened in the map room could not be subpoenaed. There were 5 of them. Verath-Sol, Verath-Sol, Chief Analyst Korath, who had spent 40 cycles studying pre-silent xenobiology, Medical Officer HFY, who had a secondary specialty in, and this was either providential or deeply alarming, human physiology, and Ensign Orataith, who was present only because it had been standing in the corridor when Verath-Sol had sealed the door, and it would have been more suspicious to push it back out. "It's a trap," said Korath immediately. "This is exactly the kind of thing the behavioral catalogs identified as a human deception tactic. The appeal to exhaustion. The claim of singularity. They called it. It pulled up something in its memory. The last survivor gambit. Documented usage in 17 recorded engagements. Effective against species, with strong pack-bonding instincts." "We don't have pack-bonding instincts," Verath-Sol said. "No, but we have investigative instincts, which is apparently just as exploitable." Korath clicked its secondary appendages. The offer of unique knowledge. The promise of a cache, designed to make us approach. And then what? HFY asked. One human? And what exactly? With what weapons? Against an 11-crew survey vessel. The behavioral catalogs document. I know what the catalogs document. HFY's tone did something Prethome had never heard from the medical officer. It went flat. Not calm flat. Flat the way a surface goes flat when everything with height has been deliberately removed. I've read the catalogs more than anyone else on this ship. I helped annotate the medical subsection during my postgraduate cycle. And what the catalogs also document, which you didn't mention, is that human emotional signaling is almost impossible to fabricate with the precision we're hearing in that transmission. Silence. The microvocal compressions, HFY continued. The breath rhythm. The particular pattern of. It searched for the translation. Didn't find one. Of what they called grief. It maps to specific physiological states. Prolonged isolation. Caloric deficit. Elevated cortisol analogs. You can train a human to deceive. You cannot train a human to produce every single one of those markers on demand while also conducting a real-time transmission. The combinatorial load is too high. A pause. That individual is not performing. That individual is in distress. Then we're being baited with a dying human, Korath said, which is worse. Verath-Sol had not spoken since opening the meeting. Now it said quietly, the cache. Everyone looked at it. What cache, it said. What does it know about that we don't? 23 light minutes away, in a salvaged emergency compartment, welded to the interior of what had once been a governance or processor and was now just a hunk of drifting metal the size of a small island. A woman named Dara Solis-Kwame was eating the last of her fungal ration blocks and listening to silence. She was 61 years old. She had been born in the transition period, old enough to remember the last years of the human resistance, young enough that she'd spent most of her childhood underground, or in transit, or in the kind of places that don't have names, because naming them would make them real. She had been alone for 41 years, for months, and somewhere between 11 and 14 days, depending on which of her two clocks you trusted. The discrepancy had stopped bothering her around year 8. The walls of the compartment were covered. That was the only word for it. Covered. Every centimeter of the interior surface that wasn't a functional panel or an airlock or a viewport was covered in writing, in drawings, in diagrams, in calculations, in what might have been, to the right kind of eyes, one of the most comprehensive documents in the history of the conflict, or its aftermath, or whatever you wanted to call 63 years of one species, slowly dismantling the physical legacy of another. She had named the compartment the archive, not because she was the last archivist, because the archive was the only thing that had kept her sane, and the only thing that made staying alive feel like a reason rather than a habit. The comm crackled. She had not expected a response. She had sent a transmission 18 times over the past 6 years, each time to a different passing vessel's frequency, each time with no reply. She had sent it tonight the way you throw a stone into a dark ocean, not expecting anything, but needing the gesture. This is Sub-Commander Verath-Sol of the Ascending Meridian, Governance Survey Registry. Please confirm your identity and species classification. Dara looked at the walls. At 61 years of writing. Human, she said. Last confirmed. Dara Solis-Kwame. Born Station 8 Provisional. Year 47 Pre-Silence. And before you ask, no, I don't have weapons. I have one EVA suit with a cracked left wrist seal, approximately 4 days of consumables, a very comprehensive personal library, and information your governance doesn't have and doesn't know it needs. She paused. And before you say it, no, this is not the last survivor gambit. I know you know what that is. I'm telling you I know you know, which a human running the last survivor gambit would never do, because the whole point of it is that you don't acknowledge the gambit exists. A longer pause from the other end. Then the sub-commander said something that wasn't in the translation buffer and had to be rendered approximately as, that is either very clever or very desperate. 41 years alone, Dara said. It's both. The docking took 6 hours. 6 hours in which Verath-Sol briefed governance on the contact carefully, in terms designed to position this as a survey anomaly rather than an extinction protocol situation, and receive back a response that was technically supportive and practically useless, because governance was 74 light hours away, and whatever was going to happen here was going to happen before any instructive directive could arrive. 6 hours in which HFY reviewed every medical protocol in the archive for treating a human who had been in isolation for 4 decades, and concluded that most of the protocols were designed for humans who were in isolation for months, not years, and that the physiological and psychological delta between those two scenarios was so large that the protocols were more useful as historical documents than medical guidance. 6 hours in which Verath-Sol sat in the secondary processing bay and did something it had never done before, which was read the human behavioral catalogs not as a threat assessment, but as a... It took a while to find the word portrait, a portrait of something that had existed, of creatures that governance had classified, and the final post-silence assessment, as resolved. What struck Verath-Sol was not the entries about combat adaptability, or the pain threshold data, or the documented cases of humans who had continued operating under tissue damage that would have incapacitated any other known biological entity. Those entries were the ones governance highlighted in training materials. Those were the entries that got cited. What struck Verath-Sol was the other entries, the ones nobody cited. The entry about humans singing, not signaling, singing, for no functional purpose, for the experience of it. The entry about a documented case of a human soldier who, during a 9-month siege, had taught 17 different non-human prisoners of war to play a game involving small tiles and patterns of numbers, because the entry quoted directly from the prisoner testimonies. She said she didn't want us to be bored. The entry about grief cycles, how humans didn't process loss and return to baseline, how the loss became part of them, restructured something in the neural architecture, so that the dead continued to exist, in some sense, inside the people who had loved them, how this was not considered a pathology, how this was considered. The entry used quotation marks, signaling uncertainty about the translation, how we stay connected. Verath-Sol closed the file when the docking alert sounded. It sat for a moment in the dim blue light of the processing bay. Then it went to the airlock. The airlock cycled twice. The first time, the environmental equalization flagged a contaminant warning that turned out to be organic particulates from the fungal ration blocks. And then the inner door opened and Dara Solis-Kwame walked onto the Ascending Meridian for the first time. She was not what HFY had prepared for. Or rather, she was exactly what the medical files had described. But the files had described measurements, and the measurements were not the same as the person. She was small, human baseline, which was to say roughly 0.4 Verath-Sol equivalents in height and considerably less in mass, with a particular quality of density that the catalogs attributed to individuals who had spent decades and manually maintained low gravity, where every movement was a deliberate choice rather than a passive one. Her face was... HFY did not have good vocabulary for faces, having evolved in a species that communicated primarily through chromatophore signaling and limb position, but it recognized the marks of prolonged extreme stress the way a geologist recognizes erosion, not as damage but as record. She was carrying a portable drive the size of 2 of Verath-Sol's finger equivalents. She held it out. 61 years of records, she said. Everything the human resistance knew about governance's internal political structure, trade systems, fleet movements, and strategic priorities from the beginning of the conflict to approximately 8 years ago, when my last information source went dark. A pause, and the location of the cache. Verath-Sol's filaments moved. What cache, it said. Not a question. A confirmation of the question it had been asking for 6 hours. The humans didn't lose the war, Dara said. Not completely. Some of us knew, maybe 30 years into the conflict, that we were going to lose militarily. We weren't going to be able to hold space. We weren't going to be able to outproduce or outmaneuver or outlast a civilization that had a 1,000-year head start on every relevant technology. She looked around the corridor, at the governance design language everywhere, the clean curves, the bioluminescent strip lighting, the way the floor-to-wall transition was beveled in the meridian crescent pattern that the Governance Aesthetic Bureau had standardized 40 years before any living member of the crew was born. So instead, we did what humans do when we can't win the fight in front of us. We started planning for the fight after the fight. She looked at Verath-Sol directly. Humans, the catalogs noted, made direct eye contact as a dominant signal, a trust signal, a threat signal, and an intimacy signal, often simultaneously, and the only way to determine which one was operative in any given moment was context, which made it effectively unreadable to most non-human species. Verath-Sol found it deeply uncomfortable. It held the contact anyway. 41 years ago, Dara said, the last coordinated act of the human resistance was not a battle. It was a deposit. We put everything we'd learned about biology, about physics, about engineering, about ourselves, about you, into a cache, hidden, designed to survive, designed to be found eventually by someone who knew what to look for. Found by whom? Verath-Sol said. Dara smiled. The catalogs had several entries about human smiles. None of them had prepared HFY for this one. Found, Dara said, by whoever came after us. Found by whoever inherited the galaxy we couldn't hold. Found by someone who might eventually be curious enough about what we were to want to know. Korath, standing 3 steps behind Verath-Sol, made a sound that its species produced under conditions of acute cognitive disruption, a rapid bilateral clicking that translated, loosely, as this changes the framework. The cache contains human knowledge, Korath said slowly. The cache, Dara said, contains everything. Medical, engineering, art, history, philosophy, every language we spoke, every song we wrote, every proof we proved, every mistake we made and understood. She paused. We couldn't survive. We decided our knowledge could. We decided that was enough. We were wrong, by the way. It's not enough, but it's what we had. The corridor was very quiet. Ensign Orataith, who had been silent the entire time, and who was 22 cycles old, and who had grown up in a cohort where the silence was just a date in a history file, said something that nobody expected. It said, "Will you tell me about them? The others? The ones who built it?" Dara looked at the ensign for a long moment. "That," she said, "is going to take a while." The argument started 6 hours after docking, which Verath-Sol had quietly predicted would happen, and which Korath had loudly predicted would not. The argument was between Korath and HFY, which was also something Verath-Sol had predicted, because the two of them had been circling each other for 6 cycles, with the particular tension of colleagues who respected each other's intelligence and disagreed about nearly everything downstream of it. The argument was about what to tell governance. "We tell them everything," Korath said, immediately. "This is exactly the kind of situation that governance protocols exist for. An active contact with a member of a species classified as resolved. An offer of unknown information. An alleged cache of unknown contents. This is not a survey anomaly. This is an extinction protocol reversal event. And if we tell governance everything immediately," HFY said, "what happens?" "We follow protocol. What does protocol say happens to the contact individual?" Silence. "I've read the extinction protocols," HFY said. "I assume you have too. The contact individual is classified as a resolved remnant. The handling procedures for resolved remnants are..." It stopped. "They're not procedures I'm willing to participate in. You don't have a choice. I am the medical officer on this vessel, and that individual is in my medical bay, and is currently classified as a patient and under treatment, and that classification lasts exactly as long as it takes a governance oversight vessel to arrive, which is 74 hours. Korath went very still. 74 hours, HFY said, "during which she is my patient, during which she remains classified under standard medical protocols, during which I can conduct a full medical assessment that will, incidentally, require extensive conversational interface to document her subjective symptom history." A pause. 41 years of subjective symptom history. You are obstructing protocol. I am performing my medical function. If governance disagrees with my methodology, they can file a review upon arrival. Another pause. 74 hours from now. Koref left the room. Verath-Sol stayed. After a moment, HFY said, without turning, "You understand that I'm not doing this for tactical reasons." "I know," Verath-Sol said. "I'm doing it because whatever she is not a remnant. She is not a residue. She is—" HFY stopped. "The catalogs keep using the past tense. Humans were. Humans had. Humans demonstrated. And I read those entries, and I keep thinking, the past tense is wrong. The past tense is something we did to them." Verath-Sol thought about the singing, about the tile game during the siege, about the entry on grief, how the dead continue to exist inside the people who loved them. "The drive she brought," Verath-Sol said. 61 years of records. You understand that governance is going to want it. Governance is going to want everything. HFY turned. Its chromatophores were cycling through a pattern Verath-Sol associated with distress of the unresolvable kind, not the distress of a problem with no solution, but the distress of a problem where all the solutions cost something unbearable. The question is what we're going to want. Dara Solis-Kwame was in a medical bay, which was the most advanced medical environment she had been in for 4 decades, and she was crying, not because of the examination. The examination had been thorough and not unkind, and HFY had explained every procedure in advance, which was more courtesy than she'd expected, and more than she probably deserved, given that she'd arrived on their ship demanding things. She was crying because there was music playing. HFY had found it in the Human Cultural Archive files that the Ascending Meridian was apparently required by survey protocol to carry a set of reference documents about major extinct or resolved civilizations, intended to prevent survey crews from accidentally disturbing significant sites. The archive was not large. It was not comprehensive, but it contained, because some archivist 60 years ago had apparently made a decision that would matter enormously to exactly one person at exactly this moment, a directory of human music, classical, folk, electronic, jazz, protest songs from 3 different centuries, children's songs, hymns in 17 languages, a lullaby. HFY had asked the ship system to play it, quietly, in the background. It had not known what it was doing, not exactly. It had made the decision the way medical decisions sometimes get made, by proximity to someone who needed something, and the ability to provide it, and a choice to act on that ability. Dara had not cried in years. She thought the mechanism might have rusted out. She thought maybe 40 years alone had taken that from her too, along with patience for small talk and the ability to sleep without a monitoring system running. But the music found something, some chamber that had been sealed for decades, and opened it, and what came out was not grief exactly, was not loneliness exactly, was the particular thing that the human behavioral catalogs had tried to describe and not quite managed, the feeling of being known, of something that came from your people, your particular and unrepeatable people, crossing space and time, and the specific tragedy of being the last one and landing, finally, in your ears. The lullaby was one her grandmother had sung. She did not know how it had gotten into a governance survey archive. She did not know whose hands had put it there. She did not know if that person had survived the silence or been taken by it. She knew they had thought to save it. She cried for a while. HFY sat in the corner and did not speak, which was the right choice, and which Dara suspected had required effort. When she was done, she dried her face on her sleeve, the sleeve of the medical garment they'd given her, which was too large and smelled like ozone, and looked at the ceiling. 41 years, she said. Yes, said HFY. I kept thinking someone would find me earlier. She said it without self-pity, as a statement of fact, the way you state the weather. I kept thinking, there are a lot of ships out here. Someone will come through this sector. Someone will find the beacon. A pause. I stopped thinking that around year 12. Started thinking of it more as a project. The archive. The writing. Like the cache, but smaller. Just for me. So that if someone found the compartment after I was gone, they'd know a human had been there. Know something about what that meant. We found you while you were still there, HFY said. Yes. Dar was quiet for a moment. I almost didn't send the transmission tonight. I almost didn't. She turned her head to look at the medical officer. I was very tired. HFY's chromatophores moved in a pattern it hadn't planned. I'm glad you were tired in the direction of sending it, it said. Dara almost laughed. The sound surprised her. Hoarse, unpracticed, like machinery that hasn't run in a season. That is the most accidentally human thing a non-human has ever said to me. I don't know if that's a compliment. It is, she said. It really is. Oritaith found her in a map room later, which was technically off-limits to patients, but which Dara had found by the simple method of walking corridors until she found a room with a good view, which was, she explained to the ensign when it appeared in the doorway with an expression of alarm, how humans navigated unfamiliar environments, not by asking permission, by moving. You should be resting, Oritaith said. I will. Dara was standing at the viewport. The dissolution zone spread out ahead. The debris field that had once been, she knew from the archive she carried, and from her own memory, and from the particular way her chest ached when she looked at it. The manufacturing ring of Station Provisional 7. Is that former human infrastructure? Oritaith said, and then stopped, apparently realizing how that sounded. I'm sorry. That was... No, it's fine. It's history. A pause. It was a station. I was born somewhere near it. Not on it. The station was already gone by then, but near it. She pressed one hand flat against the viewport. My mother talked about it sometimes. What it was like before. Oritaith was 22 cycles old and had grown up with humans as a category in a history file, and it was having a profound and destabilizing experience of categories dissolving. Not violently, not with anger or grief, though there was some of the second. More like the feeling of looking at a star long enough that it stops being a point of light and starts being a sun with planets and weather and the particular kinds of silence that exist only at altitude. Tell me about the cache, it said, not because it had been sent to ask, it hadn't, but because it needed something to stand on. Dara lowered her hand from the viewport. The cache is on a moon in the outer system, she said. Designation in governance cartography is something I can't pronounce. We called it patience. We were. Humans have a quality. She paused. Had a quality. We named things. Even when the names don't matter. Even when the things won't last. Even when we know we're going to lose, and the names will die with us. She shook her head. Especially then, maybe. Patience. Because we knew it would take a long time for someone to find it, and we were trying to believe that the someone existed, that the waiting was for something, that there was a future on the other side of the end. Was there? Oritaith said. Dara looked at the ensign. Young, genuinely asking. You're here, she said. You're curious. You asked me to tell you about them, the ones who built it. She turned back to the viewport. I don't know if that's the future they imagined, but I think it's a future they would have hoped for. The Ascending Meridian changed course 6 hours before the governance oversight vessel was due to arrive. Verath-Sol filed the course change as a survey priority adjustment, truthful, technically, and meaningless without context. The oversight vessel would intercept them eventually. That was unavoidable, but the Ascending Meridian would reach patients first, and when the oversight vessel arrived, it would arrive at a cache that had already been opened, inventoried, and transmitted. The transmission had been Verath-Sol's idea, not to governance, or not only to governance, to the academic networks, to the cultural preservation boards, to the 17 separate species documentation archives that governance funded but could not fully control, to every scholarly body that existed, which was many, because scholarly bodies were the cockroaches of bureaucratic civilization. They survived everything. Once the cache was transmitted, once 1,000 copies existed in 1,000 distributed archives, it couldn't be suppressed, couldn't be classified, couldn't be made to disappear by a protocol that hadn't anticipated the information being everywhere at once. Korath had refused to participate. It was in its bunk when the course change happened, and it had the dignity, Verath-Sol thought, to not pretend it hadn't noticed. It was choosing, in the language of governance bureaucracy, to be unaware. Dara was in the map room again. Verath-Sol found her there when it came to tell her what they were doing. She listened. When Verath-Sol finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Why?" she said finally. "You're going to get in trouble. Significant trouble. The Oversight Board is going to be very unhappy." Verath-Sol said. "Yes, we know." "Then why?" Verath-Sol thought about how to answer. It was a navigator. Its entire professional identity was built around the accurate calculation of trajectories, around knowing exactly where you were going and how to get there and what the costs of each route were. It was not, by inclination or training, a creature who acted without knowing the full shape of the consequences, but it had read the behavioral catalogs, and it had found, buried in the entry about human moral stubbornness, the ones who kept walking toward things that were going to hurt them because they believed the walking was the point, a line that the analyst had clearly written with puzzlement, trying to make sense of data that didn't fit any framework the analyst had for understanding rational behavior. The line read, "Humans appear to believe that doing the right thing has value independent of outcome. No satisfactory explanation for this cognitive structure has been identified." "Because," Verath-Sol said, "doing the right thing has value independent of outcome." Dara stared at it. "You read the catalogs." "Yes, that's—" She stopped. Her voice did something. "That's from the catalogs." "I'm aware. You took a line from an alien threat assessment of my species and used it as a moral principle." "Is it wrong?" Dara laughed. The same hoarse, unpracticed sound as before, but louder this time. And then it became something else, something that went wet at the edges, that was laughing and something adjacent to weeping at the same time. And Verath-Sol watched this and understood, with a clarity that surprised it, that this was not a malfunction, that this was the thing the catalogs called feeling more than one thing at once, which the analyst had flagged as inefficient, and which was, Verath-Sol now suspected, not inefficient at all, was perhaps the most accurate possible response to a situation that was genuinely both terrible and wonderful simultaneously. "No," Dara said when she could, "it's not wrong." Patience was a frozen moon, with a thin nitrogen atmosphere and subsurface geology that hadn't changed in 30 million years. The cache was buried 11 meters down under a rock formation that looked, from above, like nothing in particular, a quality the builders had apparently worked very hard to achieve. Dara led them to it, not because she'd been there before. She hadn't. She'd been given coordinates and descriptions and the specific geological landmarks to look for, but because she was the only one who knew what the landmarks were. The excavation took 4 hours. The cache was a sphere, 2 meters in diameter, made of a ceramic composite that the Ascending Meridian's materials analyst identified as being of human origin, but of significantly higher quality than anything in the governance archive of pre-silence human technology, which meant, the analyst said carefully, that it had been built not with what humans had at the time, but with what humans had been developing, with the engineering edge they'd never deployed, either because they hadn't had time or because they'd been saving it for something. Apparently, they'd been saving it for this. The sphere opened with a 12-digit code that Dara had memorized from a message that had been passed to her, in a manner she described as 3 steps removed and 4 times encrypted, by the last member of the Resistance Council she'd ever seen, who had given her the code and the coordinates, and then walked into a governance checkpoint and not walked out. The code worked. Inside the sphere was a second sphere. Inside the second sphere was the archive. It was larger than anyone had expected. Not physically. It fit in a standard shipping container, more or less, but in content, in scope. The Ascending Meridian's systems took 40 minutes just to index it. When the index came back, Verath-Sol looked at it for a long time. "How many languages?" it asked. 4,312, the system said. 4,211 of which are not represented in any existing governance archive. Korath, who had come down to the surface despite everything, and was standing at the edge of the excavation, looking at the sphere with an expression that even it probably couldn't have named precisely, said nothing. "Medical records," the system continued. "Engineering schematics. Mathematical proofs, 7,423 proofs, 412 of which have been independently developed by current governance academic institutions, and are considered unsolved." A pause. Literature. Music. visual art, personal testimony, spiritual texts, children's stories, jokes. Verath said. 8,647 documented jokes, the system said, cross-referenced by cultural origin, day of composition, and the category label is not standard. How funny they are. Dara made the sound that Verath-Sol was learning to recognize as her particular register of overwhelmed, not the breaking down kind, the different kind, the kind that meant something was so large she needed a moment to find the edges of it. They rated their own jokes, Verath said. They had opinions about everything, Dara said. Very strong opinions about very small things. She paused. It was one of my favorite qualities. The oversight vessel arrived 4 hours after the transmission went out. By then, 17 archives had already confirmed receipt. By then, 3 academic networks had flagged the incoming data as significant Discovery Tier material and begun automatic routing to their member institutions. By then, the jokes were already spreading across the secondary scholarly networks in a manner that several senior academics would later describe, with various degrees of irritation, as unscholarly proliferation. The oversight commander, a senior-rank Verath-class officer named Ascending, who had 28 cycles of experience and a deep institutional commitment to proper procedure, arrived on the Ascending Meridian with a containment team and a very long list of protocol violations. The containment team found Dara Solis-Kwame in the medical bay. They found her sitting across from Verath, teaching the ensign a game involving a small number of objects arranged in a grid pattern, which the ensign was losing comprehensively and seemed to be enjoying enormously. Ascending looked at this for a moment. Dara looked up. She looked at the commander's rank insignia. She looked at the containment team. She looked back at Ascending. "You're here about the transmission," she said. "Among other things," said Ascending. "I want you to know," Dara said, "that I understand the protocols. I know what I'm classified as. I know what the procedures say." She folded her hands on the table. "I also want you to know that what's in that archive is going to change the academic output of your civilization for the next 300 years, and that the medical data alone contains treatment approaches for 7 known governance spectrum conditions that your current medical community has been unable to solve." She paused. "I'm not saying that to bargain. I'm saying it because I want you to know what you're holding." Ascending was a 28-cycle veteran of governance operations. It had handled more anomalies than it could count. It was not a creature given to sentiment or hesitation. It looked at the game on the table, at the ensign across from the human, at the human's face, at the particular quality of someone who had been waiting for a very long time to talk to someone and had, against all probability, gotten the chance, and felt something move in it that it would have been very reluctant to describe in any official document. "What is this game called?" it said. Dara blinked. "It doesn't have a name," she said. "My grandmother made it up. She was waiting for a ship that was late, and she needed something to do with her hands, so she invented a game. She never named it." A pause. "I've been playing it alone for 40 years. Ascending pulled up a chair. "Show me how it works," it said. The containment team exchanged a series of looks that had no official designation in governance protocol manuals. Verath-Sol, watching from the corridor, thought, the catalogs had a word for this, for the moment when the category dissolves and what's left is just the person. The analysts had tried to classify it as a deception tactic, had struggled to find the mechanism, had eventually flagged it in the notes as unresolved. The word was disarming, not as a tactic, as a quality, as what happened when you put aside the threat assessment and just looked at the person in front of you and found that they were, against all probability, worth knowing. The official record of the next 4 hours would later be the subject of 3 separate governance review boards. The boards would use words like procedural irregularity and deviation from established protocol and, in the most strongly worded report, systematic failure of oversight function. What actually happened was this. Ascending learned the game. It was bad at it. Dara was patient. Verath was also bad at it, but for different reasons, and found this deeply funny, which made Dara also find it funny, which made Ascending find it funny despite having no context for what was funny about it, which is the specific mechanism by which humor propagates across species lines, not through shared understanding, but through shared experience of sharing. HFY completed its 41-year medical assessment, which was going to require a 45-page addendum when submitted officially, and which contained in its preliminary notes a phrase that the review board would later flag as editorially inappropriate for a medical document. Subject demonstrates remarkable psychological resilience consistent with what the Human Archive categorizes as stubbornness of the spirit. No pathological interpretation recommended. Verath-Sol spent 2 hours in the archive. It went in looking for navigation data, star charts, positional records, information that might be professionally useful, and came out having read 37 pages of poetry in a language that no translation algorithm had ever processed, understanding perhaps 1 word in 20, finding it somehow sufficient. Verath sat alone in its bunk and reviewed its behavioral catalogs, and then closed them and stared at the ceiling, and eventually, this would not appear in any official record, went to the door of the medical bay and stood in the frame and watched the game for a long time without saying anything. Dara looked up. "You can sit down," she said. "I know what the protocols." "Verath," she said. She used its name, without introduction, without the formal species marker prefix, just its name, the way humans apparently addressed people they decided to treat as known quantities. "Sit down." It sat down. "You've been the most sensible person on this ship," Dara said. "You've been right about almost everything. The gambit risk, the governance complications, the fact that this is going to be a political and institutional mess for the next decade." A pause. "You're not wrong." "Then why?" "Because being right," Dara said, "is not the same as being correct." Verath looked at her for a long time. "I don't understand the distinction," it said. "I know," Dara said. "That's okay. My species spent about 3,000 years working on it, and we never fully cracked it either." She pushed one of the game pieces across the table. "Sit. It's your turn." In the end, and there was an end to this particular story, though not to the larger one, which was only beginning. The governance review boards were not satisfied. Verath-Sol was suspended pending formal review. Verath-Sol received a formal censure. HFY's medical license was under administrative review for what the board called selective application of patient protection protocols. But the archive was out. The archive was everywhere. The jokes were particularly uncontrollable. A researcher at the Governance Institute of Cultural Study published, 6 months later, a formal analysis of 847 of the documented jokes that became the most widely read academic paper of that decade, primarily because it was, against all scholarly expectation, extremely funny. The paper's conclusion, after 200 pages of careful academic apparatus, was, "This species understood something about the relationship between pain and laughter that we do not yet have adequate vocabulary to describe. Further study is urgently recommended." The medical data saved lives. The engineering schematics were disputed, contested, reverse-engineered, and eventually contributed to 2 major technological developments in the next 15 years. The literary archive produced 4 scholarly fields that hadn't existed before. The 4,211 languages that weren't in any governance archive became the subject of a 30-year recovery project that employed 600 linguists and produced no consensus on what they all meant, but produced an enormous amount of documentation that everyone involved described as profoundly worthwhile. Dara Solis-Kwame lived for 11 more years. She spent most of them in a small habitat on a station near the dissolution zone, not far from where Patience was, not far from where Station Provisional 7 had been. She spent them teaching people, whoever wanted to learn, about the cache, about the resistance, about what the humans had known and built and loved and lost. She taught Oratate the game. Oratate taught someone else. By the time Dara died, the game existed in 8 versions across 3 species, and not one of them had a name, and that was considered, by everyone who played it, to be exactly right. She died in her sleep. She had asked, in the documentation she prepared in her last year, for one specific thing, not a monument, not a formal memorial, not a classification or a designation or any of the official apparatus of historical significance. She asked for the lullaby to be played. The compartment was full of people who had never met a human before Dara, and would never meet one after. People who had known her only at the end of her story, in the last 11 years of a life that had been shaped by things they had only learned about through archives and testimony, and the particular kind of knowing that comes from being told rather than from being there. They listened. Some of them, for reasons they couldn't fully explain in any language available to them, found their eyes doing something that the behavioral catalogs had documented as tearing response, involuntary, non-distress coded, associated with states of profound recognition. The catalogs had been uncertain about what, exactly, was being recognized in those moments. The analysts, Prothone thought, standing in the back of the room listening to a song in a language that had died with its speakers, had not had sufficient data. The analysts had never heard the music. 300 light-years away, in the outer dissolution zone, on a frozen moon called Patience in a language that governance had not yet catalogued, a capsule sat in empty rock. Not the cache. The cache was gone, opened, transmitted, distributed, copied 10,000 times into 10,000 archives, where it would outlast everyone in that room, and the room itself, and the station the room was on, and probably the political entity that had once classified it as a threat. A different capsule. A small one, left by Dara Solis-Kwame in the last months. She could still make the transit. Inside the capsule was a handwritten note in 6 languages. The note said, "We were here. We built things and named things and loved things and were afraid and were brave and made mistakes and tried again. We did not get to stay. We left you this. We hope it was enough." And then, below, in smaller letters, in a language the translation algorithms would classify for the next 20 years as humor register, exact meaning disputed. P.S. The jokes are all true. The sad ones especially. You're welcome.